And you can just do spacebar arrows.
Sure.
All right, we're ready to go? All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming today. We're delighted to have Eduard here to speak with us today on human-robotic interaction and the future of law, not the law, but law in largest sense. We have been collaborating somewhat indirectly for a little while through our mutual colleague, Jordi, and we met back in November at a conference in Barcelona, and it was one of those events where you start talking to somebody and then you start talking longer and longer, and I think we spent probably the better part of an afternoon talking about this issue. And so it's an exciting opportunity, and it's one of those moments in kind of my career where it was something new, like I hadn't thought about this before, kind of thing. And the idea that coming from the technology side, that people working in the legal space are understanding the technology and the research and using it to understand legal issues and understand policy. And then in our conversations, how it also turned around to where there are questions of policy and law that can influence what we do from the research side. What are the studies we're actually running? What are the robots we're actually designing? What are we trying to accomplish? And it's a symbiotic relationship. And the more we develop, and particularly my work in social robotics, the more we realize that there are relationships that have to be figured out. And we have to figure out how to mitigate and mediate these relationships in interesting ways. And that naturally puts us in the domain of understanding legal issues. And we've just been talking about that all morning. So delighted to have you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks. So first of all, thanks very much for inviting me. I am very excited to be here. And I really think that that is what really brought me here. It's not only that technology is trying to talk to the law, it's also the law that is trying to talk to roboticists. But in fact, we will just see, I think we will see in the presentation, that there are really interesting, I would say, miscommunications between these two worlds, and I think that we somehow need to make an effort to really understand each other. Basically, to as the way we evolve, that we truly evolve to the way we want. That in this case, it might be to protect the users, right? So. The thing is that there is a lot of robotic development going on this way. And what happens right now is that we are truly concerned on what are actually these robots that are going to end up into real environments, right? Because a lot of these, they are just happening in a lab, and they would not even go into the real world. And from the policy making side, we do believe on what is the point on actually having a law on how to regulate this if they might not be really actually in the real environment. But this is very important because basically, we do have a lot of constitutional rights. We have autonomy, dignity, privacy, etc., and so on. That no matter if these robots will be ended up in real environments or not, the subjects with whom we interact with, even if it is in the lab, they might deserve this sort of protection, right? And this is all because of the shift between industrial and service robotics, right? So we used to cage our robots when we were in an industry. So once you separate the operational robots from the human, you totally reduce the risk of harm, etc. The problem is that service robots aim at being in a close interaction with all of us, and that poses a problem, right? So we recently have some regulations in more industrial standards that try to govern this human-robot interaction, trying to look at what is the robot shape, what is the robot motion, etc. Much more concerned about the physical human-robot interaction. Then we will see after in the talk that there are people Dan or other researchers working on cognitive rehabilitation with robotic technology that might not be fully covered in this. And the funny thing is that the state of the art advances so fast that we will see the more and more having collaborative robots. So the idea that we had like in our previous regulations on caging this robot apart from the user might not be useful anymore because these robots will be co-working with us. So the thing is that we somehow have this kind of developments in both ways, in the regulation side and also in the robotic side. But the thing is that we do not really understand each other, and that's what we are here to talk about this. So like basically roboticists like building robots might not be very aware on what are the laws that they have to take into account once they are developing these issues. They might not be even aware that they play an important role on the development of such a robot, so that they might be responsible of what they are doing. Sometimes it's just like say, oh no, but what we are doing, we're just like at the very beginning of this chain that you are saying, but sometimes it's just only the fact that we want to avoid responsibility, right? Like we do not want to create a robot that then causes certain problems. And then of course like there is like this confusion about what is the law and what are the standards. And this is very important, and we'll just like make a little slide on this. Standards are not the law. They are not binding. They are not really there has been like they have been very useful for international agreements, because sometimes you do not really foresee what are the consequences of a law, but they actually are non-binding, and they are just like sometimes with just particular focus, and they totally constitute the privatization of the law. Like every time that you want to follow a standard, you just need to pay a certain amount of money to get that document, whereas the law is available to all of us. And the most interesting thing is that it constrains this kind of self-interpretation that we have, and also it fixes consequences for any violation, right? Standards do not really have that, and that is very, very important. And this gets very interesting when we see that the standards and the industry is working towards having standards that somehow understand what are like this ethical dimension of these robotic technologies. Whereas this just implies a unique form of discourse, right? Like there are no governments involved in this, and we should think about clearly like whether we want to allow the industry talking about ethics or not. And then like there is the other thing, we were talking this before with Dan Hannon about the IRB approval discussion. There's a lot of researchers that say like, well, but I have the IRB approval, right? Like as if that would exempt them like from anything that would happen. What happens with the IRB approval is basically that it is for a particular project, that every time that you need to run this study, you need to think about this. This IRB approval somehow checks the existing regulation, so there is no way that we learn from that. So like the IRB approval system does not get updated with or like over time, so that there's no way that we can somehow collect all the decisions that we have from IRB approval, so that then over time we know what are the requirements that they ask, etc., for new procedures. And basically sometimes it does not really involve whether your product or your final robot will be ethical or they will be compliant with the law. They just like sometimes focus on what is the procedure that you are following, so whether you have the informed consent with the people that you are testing, etc. And well, that is like from the robotic side, but it is also true that from the regulatory side, we do not really sometimes we do not have an immediate response when a technology comes out, right? Like when it was written, the road traffic law, it is I think that in 1968 we somehow wrote down that we need a driver for cars. So like we didn't really foresee like whether we would even be able to have a car that does not have a driver, right? Like so like current regulation is normal that it's not prepared for any of these advancements, because like we could not really foresee all these. And then there's not really like this precedent rule, right? Like in common law systems, you work more in a precedent basis. In civil law countries, it works like a bit much more complicated. And then what happens is that sometimes we come up with these good principles. Like now we have these privacy by design principles that sounds very, very well. But I have a friend actually working in European data protection supervisor, and he was like telling me, oh my God, Edward, we're all freaking out because we do not really know what does that mean exactly. So like sometimes we have a hard time to explain to roboticists what do they have to do in order to be compliant with the law, right? So what it could be great is that in the light of these unclear rules and this kind of uncertainty, that the researchers could actually like be able to conduct such of experiments, right? Like to try to go forward and try to have a kind of more precautionary vision on what they are doing. And it could be great if then it could be somehow we could formulate some sort of code for responsible experimentation so that we can somehow take into account legal aspects. And then also that from the regulatory side that we somehow try to understand what are the legal aspects that this kind of new technology should have to take into account and identify what are these aspects and somehow also try to come up with this code of responsible experimentation and also like to write down a clear procedure on how we can do that. What happens actually right now is that there is not such an ex ante effort from the legal side to understand what should be like the legal action that we should take into account in the light of new developments, and that there is no knowledge exchange between the roboticists and the regulators. And what happens basically is that when we have these two stakeholders is that when the regulator says regulation, then the roboticists just freak out and say like, oh my God, like you're going to restrict me and you're going to kill my innovation or creativity. Sometimes like we just like forgot that regulation can promote innovations, can protect the users, can help people avoid responsibility, and this goes aligned with responsible and research innovation, right? Like we should be getting to know to each other and different stakeholders, etc. But then it happens like the same thing in the other way around. Like when roboticists say autonomy, then like all the lawyers and like regulators just like freak out because they do not know how this actually works. Sometimes I was with a researcher in Spain talking about drones, and he was telling me actually sometimes you need autonomy because in the field of communications with the drone, like maybe it could be interesting to have this autonomy. So like in both sides we need somehow like to make the effort to understand exactly what are we doing and in what direction we are going, and just to, in my opinion, just to frame the discussion on what are the real core issues and try to figure out this. So it is clear policy does not move as quickly as innovation, and it is not actually true that there is a total miscommunication between these two worlds. So what happens basically is that while the first frames the rules of the power and conduct of the society, establishing rights, obligation, etc. Then, of course, the innovation in the technical side sometimes just challenges this sort of established system that we have. And basically, both systems, regulatory and robotic development, in this case, or technological development, they evolve, but sometimes they evolve in different time and also in different direction. So we will be now talking on what are like these kind of different evolutions that we are having, and try to see like what are the communications or miscommunications in this. And then at the end of my talk, I will try to explain what model we could follow so that we somehow can have a system that can co-evolve at the same time that both robotic and regulatory development happen. So in Europe, we have been working on different European projects that they have trying to figure out what are the legal aspects that robotic technology poses. And last May, the European Parliament came up with a draft report trying to figure out what were exactly like the legal aspects of this technology. This report, it has turned now into a resolution, and this is the official opinion of the European Parliament on what is the legal aspects concerning robotic technology. Now, just for you to know, the only one that can initiate a legislative process in the European Union is the European Commission, and now the European Commission actually has received this resolution from the European Parliament, and in 6 weeks after this was approved, needs to take the lead and give an official response to this document, and then the European Commission can figure out whether it will continue with the legislative process or not. So like we may have or not a future regulation on this, right? There are some, this document is very interesting. It has created a great debate on different aspects, and I will not really touch in all of them, just like I will give a glimpse of different aspects that I was interested. One of these, like how, like whether roboticists will be obliged to embed ethics or not into their systems. What does the responsibility of the teacher mean? And then whether roboticists will remain accountable for the social, environmental, and human health impacts that robots may pose to current and future generations. That is actually like what this says. Then of course, like the question is like, what is the applicable legislation at this, right? So we will talking about design, safety, liability, care robots. And we'll try to see like the development of the law in certain issues, and then also like what the roboticists or like are doing. So concerning about design, I have this friend, Beste Özkan from Turkey, working in Roma, talking about how can we actually design social robots that can tackle the core of the issue that they are trying to solve, right? Like in this case, we have been working largely with autistic children or with traumatic brain injury children. And she came up with all these different aspects that it could be very good to take into consideration once you are designing the robot, right? And she talks about interaction, motivation, also what is the embodiment, like whether it matters or not that the robot has X shape or not. But the truth is that in 2018, it came into force like this data protection regulation in the European Union that will have this right of privacy by design. So like the more and more we will be seeing that legal and ethical principles will have to be embedded somehow in the design. This is very interesting because, for instance, Ronald Lenz in 2014 wrote an article explaining that, well, first of all, it's not very clear whether what are the aspects that we need to think when we implement this privacy into the system. So, like whether you have to use a particular code, etc., that can be used for informing policies, as one professor did at MIT. But then also, like, what are other the aspects that you need to take into account from the very design perspective? So there was this, I put here like the case of the Dutch bot that bought marijuana. So basically, like they had a bot that I think in 2014 that started buying illegal goods in darknet, and I was thinking about whether you could have a robot that could buy marijuana on the internet, yes or no, right? And this might be very clear in here where the purchase of such a product is illegal, but once you are in the Netherlands, for instance, it's completely okay to buy marijuana. So maybe we should be thinking about also including some sort of compliance by design principle so that when the robot is in one place or in another one, is compliant with the regulatory system of that country. And how complicated would be that, because of course all the countries are like very different, but that at the same time you will be shipping all these robots in different countries. And then also, of course, like whether your robot will have to be ethically designed, right? Like we saw like this IEEE initiative, but then also like the British standard that was released in 2016, also trying to work on this. And yeah, so this is very interesting. And at the very end, like the discussion on this design thing is like, until what extent the roboticists will be obliged to incorporate all these aspects into their design process, right? So roboticists still struggle on how the robot is standing up. So like if you just come to them and say like, well, and now in your design you will have to include all these aspects too, they will be like a very, it will be very, very difficult, especially because like when then we come the lawyer, we do not really know how you have to do it, so this will be very fun. Then also, when it comes to safety, I want to play this video. Basically, oh sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, I don't know. James, do you know?
have to hit escape, sorry.
Sorry.
Let's see. Escape. Let's go back here.
Braking system that would only recognize other cars but not other users, and that it was like the result. And then it was like very concerned on how the price might undermine safety, which is very interesting. Gurvinder Virg, which I wrote an article with, he's the chairman of the industrial standard of personal care robots, and he was involved in this XLX European project, and they came up with this good idea, I think, no, like to make available different exoskeletons to the society. Exoskeletons are like these robotic devices that are fastened to your body and help you walk. And I just realized that the deluxe version is the one that incorporates slippery ground, uneven ground, etc. Which was very funny because I was thinking like, oh, slippery ground, right? Like I don't know what is that, but we normally mop the floor, so I was thinking about my grandma, if she would like be using this as a skeleton, and of course like maybe she does not really have a lot of money, she bought like just the basic one, and then if she would like sleep or not. So I was thinking like, well, that is an interesting approach, and this just goes with physical safety. Then another thing that is very interesting from the robotic side is that the use of reinforcement learning could improve robot performance and thus safety, right? And well, I am not a technical person, so I excuse if this is not very accurate, but some reinforcement learning is just well, as Calvin says, a way of programming agents by reward and punishment without needing to specify how the task is to be achieved, right? And basically, this is like the basic model on how does it work. So it needs to find a control policy that will maximize the observed rewards over the lifetime of the agent. This has been used in different applications, but I really like this quote, and I think that I will read it from Amodei, that says, systems that simply output a recommendation to human users, such as speech systems, typically have relatively limited potential to cause harm. By contrast, systems that exert direct control over the world, such as machines controlling industrial processes, can cause harms in a way that humans cannot necessarily correct or oversee. And this I really like it very much, right? Like because robots are running into this physical world, right? And sometimes they modified it. And it is particularly interesting because in 2015 there was this patent that was released by Google, and basically among all the interesting things of this patent, that it's basically patenting the use of cloud robotics to personalize robotic technology. It just says this. I will read it because it's very interesting. The robot may prepare food for the user using peanut oil. The user who may be allergic to peanut-based foods may eat the meal and have an allergic reaction. the user may further scold the robot for cooking the meal with peanut oil. Scolding may be considered a negative feedback response where the user is directing a negative reaction toward the robot for an action that the robot committed. On the other hand, a positive feedback response may be a positive reaction toward the robot for an action that the robot committed. I find it very interesting, right? Like on how from the one side we would believe that reinforcement learning would improve performance of the robot, but sometimes and in particular situations, we might just realize that we would have to be very, very careful with that. And then this aspect that says the robot may permanently modify information in the user profile to include the user's allergic reaction to peanut and avoid anything to do with peanuts in the future. When anaphylaxis is a tricky situation. I remember a friend of mine, we went to a Thai restaurant, and even if he did not eat anything, the fact that they were using peanut oil, it was just a very funny situation. He said, "Edward, you just need to bring me to the hospital. If you don't do so, in 2 hours I might die. And don't panic." And say yeah, whatever. So I think that it would be very interesting if your robot starts doing like this. It's just an example on how we should think about this, right? And then the patent also says in another moment, it says the robot may respond to the negative reinforcement response by continuing to perform other tasks until a positive reinforcement response is received, which is also very interesting, right? Because when it involves the safety of the user, it might be interesting to use it or to apply it in a much more safe exploration. So maybe what we could use is to try to have testing zones so that we can test the robot until it is safe enough, and then shape it before. And well, of course, maybe we could have some restrictions in several situations or contexts, right? Then the other thing about perceived safety is that robotics combines the promiscuity of information and the capacity to do physical harm. But the fact that we have been using robotic technology in cognitive rehabilitation makes me think whether there should be also some safeguards concerning this cognitive human robot interaction, right? That nowadays there's nothing written. We do not even know whether we should have any guideline at this regard or not, right? But sometimes we interact with machines in a non-physical way, but it's not really clear on how we could do that. And then the European Parliament says that every one of us should be able to use a robot without fear of physical or psychological harm, but it's not very clear who should be afraid of that. If children might not be afraid of the robot, but parents yes, etc., and who might be the one responsible for deciding that. When it comes to liability, there's a lot of things to talk about here. I just want to talk about responsibility gap. There's a lot of discussion on whether the autonomous decision-making processes of the robots might cause in the very end that we have a gap on the responsibility system, so that we cannot blame any human on what are their responses. And the thing is that Johnson was saying that maybe it's just up to all of us in the society whether we should consider to have this kind of or allow the existence of this gap, right? Right now it's not very clear on how it is going to work. European Parliament just said that they would introduce the responsibility of the teacher, and the responsibility of the teacher, it just says that the greater the robot's learning capability or autonomy is, the lower other parties' responsibility should be, and the longer the robot education has lasted. The thing is that I'm not sure whether this will overcome the responsibility gap, basically because robots can learn on their own, or they can learn through other robotics. So I'm not sure whether this should be or not the case in this case. Johanna Bryson, I attended a conference and she was talking that AI is not an ape like other species. It is a technology or a utility. And because computation takes time, space and energy, AI, like human intelligence, comes largely from culture. And she was saying that it might inherit our prejudice also. But she was like talking that normative ethics is not a thing to be scientifically discovered. It requires co-authoring. So that maybe we should be thinking more about what are the actions or functions of different robot technology that might be able so that it might be able to give clarity at this regard on whether we will have or not any sort of robothood or not. So far we have been seeing like how the design works in a way, and like whether legal or ethical aspects might be working in the future with these, and also like safety and how we understand safety of the user in very different ways. And now I want to talk about care robots, so not about a specific issue, but just like to give you an example on how the legal domain might not really understand what this technology is talking or is doing actually. And this is very serious because in 2012 there was like this Eurobarometer that was asking the general population on what were their attitudes towards robotic technology, and 60% of the population just decided that they wanted to ban robots that would interact or that would take care of children, elderly, or disabled, which is very fun because a lot of conferences are talking about therapeutic and educational robots, so that might be like a very interesting way. So on the one hand, there's like this concern on the society, and then when it comes this European Parliament resolution, so like the official response of European Parliament, there is no therapy or education word in the document that is concerned about educational robots or therapeutic robots. The only thing that exists is these two paragraphs about care robot technology. And I just like want to show you like some of these, like how to understand like how dangerous it could be that we can have a future policy, even if this is not binding, but how dangerous it could be if we some sort of have this kind of precepts. So it says that human contact is one of the fundamental aspects of care, which we all agree, right? But it believes that replacing the human factor with robots could dehumanize caring practices, right? This is very funny because like somehow we assume that we do have this human-human interaction when it comes to care matters, right? And I would love to think about an elderly or a disabled, etc., that it truly has this and that it truly can affect their human-human interaction, right? Like the reality, I think that it's not really the case. I do think that care is getting more costly and costly, and that we are busy working, etc., and so on. So like that might not be the case, and also some people say like, oh, and why they don't promote to have like these sort of programs that they say, oh, students living with elderly, right? Like, so, okay, instead of using robots, you just like put a student that might be interested in sharing the space and so on. But the problem is that in the light of something that happens to the elderly, the student might not be there, the student might not have nursing skills, and maybe it would be like very overwhelmed by what happened in that situation, right? So like maybe a robot just like can call someone that takes care of that. But not only that, some of this technology, this is the robot of Jordi Albo-Canals, when he was working here at Tufts. Some of this technology tries to promote human-human interaction. So this robot has been used for autistic children, and basically it works in a very nice way so that when the child is trying to work in an exercise and he has a problem, he asks the robot, oh, what should I do? And then the robot says, ask your classmate or ask your teacher or something like this, right? So sometimes this technology is not replacing humans. It's just promoting human-human interaction. And then also, like, we do not really realize that some of this robotic technology can perform tasks that robots that humans cannot do, right? Like we were talking about this with Christopher and Dan before. So exoskeletons, for instance, like help to be in a standing position in a much easier way than using humans. But not only this, in some situations, you might not want to have a human doing certain tasks. This is a wheelchair in Pittsburgh that is a robotic wheelchair that incorporates an industrial arm that is trying to, and they are trying to develop a feeding function to help elderly to eat. It has been found that no one wants to be fed again because it's just, well, no one, maybe like that is a bit exaggerating, but not a lot of people, because like the only moment when you are fed is when you are very young. And when it comes to this point, it gets like a bit embarrassing. So like they found out that having a system that could help you feeding yourself without the need of a human could be like very practical, in fact. And then also that there are robots that they do not talk to you. So maybe this human talk that might not be very easy. And this is just very obvious that because we interact with robotic technology in very various forms. And then like the precept just goes to the part that says like these will enable medical staff and caregivers to devote more time to diagnosis and better plan treatment options. And again, we were talking about this with Christopher and so on. I have a friend of mine that he is a radiologist, and he was very concerned about the advancements with IBM Watson being applied in breast cancer and in other aspects. And the fact is that with this kind of technology, even if this is not a robot, okay, but just like to think about like the scenario, how it works, it might be true that this technology would free more the general practitioner, but it would maybe kill the job of my friend, right? Because he's just a radiologist, he's not really helping people. So like we should really think about what is this technology and doing. And then it says humans will still be needed in caregiving and will continue to provide an important source of social interaction that is not fully replaceable. And we agree with that. So we got to the point where somehow, like, I don't know if it was clear or not, but somehow like we understand that there is like this sort of miscommunication between us. It's just that we do not talk to each other. I think that it's perfectly understandable that roboticists need to somehow respect certain legal safeguards, but it's also understandable that roboticists expect from us to give them like clear rules on what do we mean when we want to tell them to do certain things, right? I really like this quote of Alfred North Whitehead. He says, the art of progress is to preserve order amid change and to preserve change amid order. And I think that that is very good and works perfectly in this case. This is a picture of Pittsburgh. Basically what is happening right now is that regulation and technology development are somehow like following different directions. And you might tell me, well, this happened also with other technologies, and it is true, but not because that always happened this way. It needs to be continuing this way. So like somehow to have a system that or a methodology that could somehow make these two paths go back again like to a common path, then maybe we could reach to a point where we could have like much more meaningful regulations. And then also we would have like roboticists that are also much more willing to apply all these aspects. So in University of Twente, we are working on at least a theoretical model because of time constraints and a lot of things, but at least a theoretical model on how there could be like an intertwinement between robotic technology and regulatory development. So this goes more or less like in line with what the European Parliament like wants to do in this document that they just released. Even if of course like it's very complicated and we don't know exactly like how it could be, right? Like, but they say that a future legislative instrument should be based in an in-depth evaluation, determining like or the risk management, etc. And of course it emphasizes the testing robots in real life scenarios, that it would be like very or a key aspect to go ahead and identifying what are the real aspects that we need to take into account. So like, this is our model. I think that it tries to be very simple. I think that it will be very complicated, but somehow like it could help us trying to figure out what is exactly the things that will turn into policy and try to frame the discussion in a much more efficient way, I would say, because there is like a lot of discussion going on, but it's not very clear what actually will matter at the very end on the technology and so on. So from the very beginning, we will start explaining the model. So the idea is that sometimes we already have a lot of regulations. So like when people say, oh, there's no regulation for cars, autonomous cars. And it's like, well, we do have regulation. Like the only thing is that before we had a driver, now we don't have one, right? So like, let's try to figure out like what are the things, right? So like, it is true that right now, I think that it's very difficult because these robotic technologies evolve very fast and they are being applied in very different ways. People can give new uses to this, etc. And it's very complicated to understand what are the policies that need to be taken into account to make this happen, right? And basically, like in order to cope with that, we somehow would need a system that could identify different factors so that it could redirect to us what are like the different existing policies that might apply to our product. And this can be very different. This is just an example, right? Like so, but maybe we have different laws for different types of users. Maybe the context matter, right? Like if it is just a rehabilitation center or if it is a research center, it might be different, the constraints that you need to follow, etc. And then like, of course, like it would matter like what are the characteristics of the robot or what are the capabilities of it, etc. The thing is that asking roboticists to look at this is very complicated. And it is true, though, that we were talking with Dan before that, is that everyone gets very anxious about having to go through the IRB approval and so on. But it's also true that they're in this interdisciplinary team that they have, they do not have a lawyer that takes care about all this, right? So that could be very interesting. We can have a lawyer, but also the lawyer will have a lot of difficulties on having that. Sometimes we can have a program that does this. Okay, so this is one thing. So once we would have like these regulatory robots, so like once we would know like what are the requirements that we need to have, then it could be very good if we could have like a robot impact assessment. So like the use of impact assessments is very new in the law domain. It will be a requirement in this data protection regulation in 2018 in data protection matters. So like there is the privacy impact assessment that deals with privacy issues. Then the same David Wright was the one leading this cause, and he said that maybe we needed a wider instrument for surveillance systems. So like he created this surveillance impact assessment, which it goes very well because it goes beyond this harm-based approach, and it includes other aspects like economic, social, or ethical aspects. There are right now no impact assessments for particular technologies. So like creating another instrument like robot impact assessment might look a bit different, but the truth is that a robot can pose a lot of different problems, right? Like it can have privacy impacts, but not only privacy as informational privacy, like it can have like a bodily privacy or behavioral privacy, etc. Then also like it might be we saw that, right? Like with the safety issues, for instance, like in the privacy impact assessment, safety is not there, and like in surveillance neither, etc. So like there are like different implications that would make us believe that having an impact assessment on this could be very good. And the fact an assessment could somehow clarify what are the impacts of this technology, and this could really be very useful to avoid this kind of large discussion on whether robots will take over, if robots deserve rights or not, etc. Like it could really like make this very useful. And in fact, that there are no protocols on how to use this technology. Like as we have protocols like on how to use an airplane, for instance, you have some simulator hours. Then before it takes off, you need to have or to do this protocol, and then if not, you cannot take off. Now when you run like a Da Vinci, it's a surgery robot, for instance, you don't have any protocol, right? Like each hospital has its own protocols, and I am not saying that they are not careful about that, right? But there is not really a formal written procedure on how are we going to use a robot before its use. So the regulation sometimes tells something to the roboticists. In Japan, for instance, the regulation said we will be using these testing zones, right? Like we do not have this in Europe yet. But they started like having testing zones for regulatory purposes, and in fact it's very fun how it works. Like basically they deregulate some zones. Like for instance, you want to put an autonomous car in a city, so you need to allow certain streets in that city so that your autonomous car can work that. So then we can know exactly like what are the procedures that we need to follow in order to do this. And in 2015, I went to see Dr. Nishida, and they are using simulators with human-robot interaction. So not virtual agents, but for human-robot interaction. And this somehow like allows a communication between the regulator and the roboticist in different various phases of the design. So like this allows, like if we are using simulators, like this could be very useful like in the design phase. So like maybe we could be implementing privacy by design aspects into the simulator. Maybe then we can have like the prototype and actually test it in real environments, etc. The only problem with that, and also with the autonomous software that we were showing before, is that impact assessments are just seen as an accountability tool. So it's like just a way to prove that you are compliant with the regulatory system. This means that the compliance of this requirement does not per se update the policy. And this is what happens with IRB approvals, right? It's true that you have the IRB approval, but there is no way that we can learn over time about all these decisions that we have been having. And this is just such a waste, I would say, in my opinion. Like it could be very good if that we could have like a kind of repository or a kind of system that we could check what are the different developments that we have been having in robotic technology, so that we could say, okay guys, so this is the existing regulation, but we have been allowing this testing in these certain environments, etc. Do we learn from this? We not, etc. This could be very good to speed the process of updating the policy. And this is what happened precisely with the same wheelchair that we were talking before, right? A wheelchair is a medical device. An industrial arm it goes in the machinery directive. And the feeding function, like it's not very clear where it goes, right? When you have all this combined, you don't have a testing zone for this robot. You don't have any particular protocol. You don't have anything, I could say, like concerning this. So like it could be great that once we have like this robot, then next time we can have, okay, so these guys in Pittsburgh, they were developing such a robot, so, and they followed this, or they followed this testing things, so that now we somehow have a precedent to for new developments, right? So like the interesting thing about this model is not to automatize the compliance of the robotic that tries to develop a robot, but also to try to identify these gaps, these issues, and these concerns that they find out, because this is the only way to truly frame this discussion that we were saying, right? And I do believe that the regulatory side, they should know about these gaps, and they should address them, right? So like somehow, like if we could have this kind of autonomous system that you just like check, as we said, right? Like now we run this software, but at the same time we did not, we got the report, but we said, well, but this does not really help me, right? Because I wanted to develop one exoskeleton for activities of the daily living, for an elderly, and it doesn't really say anything like, I don't know, like for instance, like cognitive aspects of this technology, like because they're wheelchair users more all of the time, like they might be afraid of using the device, etc. What are the concerns that we should take into account? So like the idea is that try to extract knowledge from this system, so like these kind of unsolved issues, and try to report them. And try to report them to the competent authority. This competent authority might be very different. Like this regulatory body might be like at the European Union level, for instance, because we have, the Parliament wants to have like this European Robotics Agency, which might happen or not, but we do have in the European Commission the Robotics and Artificial Intelligence in the DG Connect. And this is inspired by If You Smell Something, Say Something. Carnegie Mellon, they are developing a system that when you smell something in the streets, you have an app that sends an automatic report to the competent authority about this, because they are very concerned about the quality of air in that area. And that is totally automatized, right? Like, so some sort of this system could be very good, right? Like we have this concern, we want to have an answer, right? And this answer could be used for future developments, right? So then the competent authority should be very active on giving response to this and like writing guidelines and other things. For instance, like what happens right now is that we have some sort of guidelines on developing drones and also autonomous cars, but I haven't heard any guideline on care robots. And they are meant to be using like with elderly and with children and with disabled people, right? So I think that could be very interesting. So these gaps, of course, they need to be solved in the legal domain, like in very different, like the legislative process. We are very aware that it is very difficult to be updated, etc., and so on, right? But it does not mean that we cannot do certain things, right? Like, so we could have some deregulated zones, or like trying to experiment by iteration. We do one thing and then we learn longitudinally. This is what happened, for instance, in UK, right? They just said in 2015, they said, well, here you can use autonomous cars, right, as a kind of living lab or testing zone. And in fact, like, we do have a lot of living labs in European Union. So the idea is that have a system that we can be automated, identify gaps. And how do we identify these gaps? Well, running maybe this system, but then also like over the time of the development of the robot, we might find also like some gaps. So where do you find them? Well, maybe in the living labs, right? And in these living labs already exist. You don't have to spend money on that, and I'm sure that they will be happy to become hubs on this and like being developed in this. Of course, this might have to be in some sort of upscaling mode over time. So like you might be having a very controlled environment, so like a kind of research center or something, like developing this, because when seriously compelling vulnerable interests are at risk, it is going to be very important to secure them. But somehow, like then you can learning over time. Then you can somehow upscale this. So like in your University of Twente, that what happened with drone technology. They just started like to have evaluations in an airbase. We have an airport to use robotic technology, and after some positive evaluations, then from the airport they went to the university, so they were flying the drones, etc. And then then the process like normally goes into the municipality and etc. So like. Not only robotic development, but also a regulatory experiment might provide also information on what is the usefulness of this change of rules, and to provide some sort of an evidence-based underpinning the choice for a new or permanent regulatory regime to overcome the existing regulatory disconnect, right? So like, it is true that sometimes we need to have these experiments from the technological side so that we can know exactly whether this technology is working, etc. and so on. But at the same time, if we have some experimentation in our legal system, maybe we can learn on how to be efficient and how to frame this robotic development in a much efficient way, I would say. So, yeah. So the very end of the model, and I will end up practically here the talk. It is then the ending part is the regulatory impact assessment. This is very new. Has been called ex post evaluation, legislative evaluation. So like the idea is, there are very like different ways of learning of regulatory impact assessment. Our idea is to focus on learning evidence utilization side of this way, and the idea is that we try to find evidence that the assessment has been conductedly correct. So like we try to use like living labs and prototypes to get evidence that there is the need to change the policy. But then once we change effectively the policy, we somehow want to check that whether that was the right thing to do or not, right? So yeah, and that is what basically happened with DASBot. They were trying to use these sort of robots in Picciolo in the University of Pisa, and basically like they asked permission, the municipality. So the municipality allowed a testing site, and the testing site was like several streets and a square, and they draw like a yellow line to draw like where the robot, even if it was autonomous, where the robot would go to increase like legibility from the user side. And then like the robot was obliged to stop 3 times. And then also they created ad hoc traffic signs to allow that to happen. So sometimes that is what happens, right? Like sometimes you just want to put a robot, you just ask for the permit, then the regulatory side said, okay, I will allow you, but let's try to be sure. We will put signs, we will do this, etc. and so on. The only problem with this is just that it's very informal right now. Like right now we do not know in another context, like what we would do if we want to have like a similar robot into the municipality or etc. So like it could be very interesting to learn from that, and then to have like this precedent that can be used for other projects. The system could learn over time, and then it can improve like its accuracy, and this, I could say, that could promote like a much more safer technology where it tries to avoid. Yes. Well, yes. So like it promotes a safer technology because it allows this kind of continuous communication between both of them, right? Now we will say in the conclusions that this would allow to have or to avoid over or under regulated scenarios, because over-regulated scenarios might cause an impact to the roboticists, but under-regulated scenarios might have an impact on society. So that is very good. And this is a very good opportunity to, for first time, the regulators to provide much more meaningful guidelines, right? So that we somehow understand what you guys are doing, and and we can actually like frame the discussion in a very better way, I could say. So conclusions. I like this one because this quote, it says, considering the rapid developments in ICT, mobility and society, and the timelines of EU and national legislation processes, it seems a fact of life that such legislation will never be able to provide concrete rules for data protection on a specific ITS application or risk to be outdated at the moment it enters into force. This is for the Intelligent Transport System Plan. We need to change that, right? Like it's very funny, like how we already envisage that particular legislation is going to be outdated when it is going to be enforced, but we're not doing anything against this, right? So like somehow like the problem is that it takes much more time, etc. But somehow like if we could have like a system that could improve this in a really fast way, then we could somehow have actually legislation that really have time. Yes. The development of robotic technologies and the great concern that this is posing in the regulatory side and in a lot of parts of the society, whether robots will take over, whether robots will have rights, etc., and so on, somehow like really pushes towards trying to have a down-to-earth manner to say, okay, what is this technology doing? What are our existing laws? What we need to change and what we do not need to change, right? So somehow this, as we said, like this avoids over and under-regulated scenario. Just to finish this, does anyone know what does this mean? It's the European label for ecological products or bio-friendly products. There's a lot of people that says like, oh, we don't want regulation, and because regulation will constrain the way we act, etc., and so on. So this is actually similar in this case. Everyone trying to put an ecological product into the market has to go to a very strict procedure to follow that. And basically, yeah, like someone saw the business model behind this. So being compliant with more strict regulations would allow them to have a place into the market. And I do believe that this can happen the same with robotic technology. Like once we understand that being compliant with the regulatory system is not a burden, it's not a crazy thing to do, but another way to be or to create safer technology, then I'm sure that we will truly follow the procedures. Thanks.
I don't see people at the door ready to kick us out, so I'm sure we can take some questions if there are any.
Sure.
Question.
Yeah.
So from what you say, I got a bunch of time mixed up between regulation in the design process and regulation of the release product.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit confusing. Like it seems some of the ideas when it comes to regulating design and development, they're not too practical because these products are just not designed to be given away. Some companies do involve working in stealth mode, where they don't share their technology until a certain time when they deem it appropriate. But if you have a model in which you're trying to sort of apply a learning system of applying what you used at location A, you want to use it at location B so that you sort of have a precedence model, you're violating some of the business strategies that people actually want to use to have a successful product.
Yeah. Well, that would happen like when you are like in a concrete factory, right, or in a concrete company that they are developing their own technology. That does not exempt the fact that you need to be complying in each part of the world with its own regulation, right? So that is totally true. This becomes much more evident when you are in the in here. it becomes much more much more feasible or much more intelligible when it goes to the real environment, right? So like each company might be developing their own products. It's true that if these products or robots are in contact with humans, like it could be interesting in any case, like to be sure that they are really having all their safeguards, because these humans might be hurt, etc. and so on. But what really concerns this approach is when they truly go to the market, right? So like what we try to do, and that might be a bit confusing, but at the same time, I think that it makes sense, is that there might be, or it would be very interesting to apply some safeguards at this level, so that we can, at the same time that we are developing the product, we can come up with a safer product already here. Because sometimes, like if not, you already have the prototype, and then you just need to adapt the regulatory safeguards, etc. and so on, like on the product. But in here, you still can change that product according to that. And then, of course, like once it goes to the real environment, then there might be like much more other aspects to take into account that you could not do it in this case, right? So somehow it makes sense also to have some sort of legal appraisal in here, so that you tackle different problems, but that at the same time, this is it goes into the same way to make a safer product, right? So like in this phase, you might be able to change the product. In here, you might not, but somehow you can manage the risks posed with this. That's why the use of the risk assessment. I don't know if that answers you.
Well, yeah, I'm sort of answering, but it sounds, the way, there's even a question of what is a robot. We didn't even talk about what is a robot.
Oh, yeah.
And and the main challenge with the robot is different from a car. You know what a car does. You don't know what a robot does.
Yeah.
When I build a robot, I tell you what it does. And trying to regulate what my robot does is a very difficult question, because I decide what it does. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then you might want to avoid responsibility, right? Like, so it's like you decide what the robot does, but at the same time you don't want to be responsible if it does something. So then this trade-off needs to be sorted out somehow, right? And then it might be like, okay, you can develop it and design, and you can choose it. But as we were like in the design phase, you are really free to use all these aspects, but then you need to somehow say, okay, you will have to do this. Like, do whatever you want, because of course, like we are in an experimental zone. Like most of these, like they're in an experimental zone. There are these safeguards that you need to be taken into account, but of course we somehow acknowledge this room that you need to do the experiment and so on, right? So, yeah.
So I'm a student not here, but at the occupational therapy department. So basically I'm trained into really helping people with disabilities or with other conditions to restore their functions and be able to do their daily activities. So right now I'm working at the lab in collaboration with the CS department on creating a social robot for people with Parkinson's disease and helping them to sort medications, because medication adherence is actually a big issue these days. So one, I'm always thinking in terms of a user perspective, not the other way around, so I might be very critical. But one thing that I was thinking about was when we were creating this social robot, we kind of wanted it to be like a mediator between the actual clinicians or physicians with the care partner and the patient. And what happens is that for some reason the client buys this social robot and then it's helping with the medication sorting, but at one point the client may not be compliant to the social robot and do whatever he wants to do. So what is the responsibility of the social robot in terms of reporting that non-adherence to the physician? Or is privacy more of a hierarchical, like a higher issue than a safety issue? So that's just like something that maybe you might consider in terms of regulation, that there might be a hierarchical system.
That is what happens with, that's why I like this model of with this interaction between these two ways. So me, as a lawyer, or the regulatory side will come to you and say like, well, you need to do a balance between both interests, right? And then you will say, what does that mean, right? Like, do we need to take care of this? Like, does the robot need to report? Yes or no? The problem that right now is that there is no answer to this, because the regulatory side just comes with this vague interpretation. So then, like, the actual people working on this does not know what to do, right? So that would be like in our system, like a kind of concern, and say like, okay guys, like I do have this problem. Like I am doing this work, an amazing job to be sure that these people are taking their medication, but there's no way I can assure that he takes it or not, or if he does not take it, I am not sure whether I can report that or not, and whether I violate his privacy or not. And then, like, of course, the response from the regulatory side might be very different, I would say. Like, maybe you can say, okay, so depending on the level of Parkinson, we will allow like this report, because it's just like we just notify this person is not taking the medication, and maybe then the actual response for the other person like might say, okay, so the doctor will intervene, or the familiar will intervene, or the person will decide whether yes or not, right?
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to intervene because we have another group that needs to use the room.
Okay, just to say that then if we say something to this and we make a decision, that could be used for other types of diseases, right? Like not only Parkinson, but also dementia, right? And then dementia will be another world, right? But we can have this precedent, say like, okay, so with this Parkinson guys, we decided that time. How do we do it now, right? So then we can learn over time. So at the beginning it will be complex, but then I think that it will be easier.
Thank you very much.
All right, yeah, sure.
We're gonna have to